Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. In the Housing Act of 1949, America promised a decent home and suitable living environment to every American family. In 2006, the continuing problem of homelessness and the rise in at-risk families shows how far short of that goal we have fallen. But this failure is not only an unkept promise to ourselves. The right to adequate lodging is an internationally recognized human right. And in this sense, the ability of this country to speak authoritatively on poverty may be severely compromised by our own underperformance. In a world environment marked by record levels of inequality, a serious response to homelessness is a moral imperative and a practical necessity. My guest is Maria Foscarinis, founder and executive director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. Maria, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Maria. And I think that the recognition of homelessness as an international human right, as I just said, may be a surprise to many people. But in fact, I believe we are signatory to some covenants worldwide on this matter, are we not?
This is true. The United States has signed on to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has ratified it. And although the main goals of that covenant is to protect civil and political rights, it includes rights that are directly related to homelessness. For example, it protects the right to life. And in this covenant, that term, the right to life, has a somewhat different meaning from the meaning we're accustomed to in U.S. political debate.
What is that meaning?
Well, the right to life really protects people once they're born and protects them from conditions that are detrimental to their life.
Right.
So, for example, homeless people often, in fact, die as a result of living on the streets, either because of extreme cold or extreme heat, as well as risks to their health as a result of not having a home. So right to life is directly implicated by the existence of people with literally nowhere to live in this country.
Right. Now, what you've just put forth for us, Maria, is a part derives from the UN covenant, does it not?
Exactly.
The Declaration of Human Rights.
Right.
Is there also an agreement we have within this hemisphere, within the context of the OAS?
Yes.
That brings forth pretty much the same.
Right. There's the Declaration on the Rights of Man that applies to the Americas, and of course the United States is part of the Americas.
Right.
And I should also mention another covenant which has been signed but not yet ratified by the United States, which is very directly on point, and that's the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights.
Right.
And that explicitly contains a right to housing, among other basic economic and social rights.
Who monitors, how are these rights monitored, Maria? I mean, are there official bodies that do that, or non-governmental organizations that keep tabs on performance?
Both. Officially, the covenants themselves create monitoring bodies within the UN system, and there's also within the America system, there's a separate body that monitors compliance with these rights. In fact, every so often the United States is reviewed for its compliance with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That review is coming up in July. So next month the U.S. is coming up for review by the Human Rights Committee in Geneva for compliance.
And of course, that's been annual, has it not?
It's every 5 years.
Every 5 years. Well, looking back then, we'll soon have the next reading, so to speak, of our performance. But looking back to the last evaluation, how did we come out? Or how have we been coming out?
The last evaluation did not really include a focus on issues such as homelessness. It focused primarily on strictly civil and political rights issues.
I see.
This year, we are hoping that the committee will also focus on issues like homelessness, and we have in fact submitted testimony and what's called a shadow report to the committee.
That would be a report provided by your organization
Exactly.
on this subject.
Exactly.
And I think organizations like yours, non-governmental organizations as they're categorized, must be extremely important in this international monitoring of performance.
I think so. And this is really a new trend here in the U.S., I think, that we are part of. And that is for for organizations such as ours to really take seriously human rights as they apply here at home.
Right.
Often in this country, when we talk about human rights, we think they apply somewhere else, somewhere other than here at home. But we are starting to use these principles and these instruments here in our domestic advocacy, and there are a number of organizations that are doing this. Of course, in the civil and political rights, there's a longer history of this.
Right.
But we're now starting to focus on economic and social rights as well.
I know that you, and perhaps in this very regard, Maria, recently returned from a conference held in Los Angeles. But what was the nature of that? Was that a look at the topic we're talking about today?
Exactly.
It was?
That was a focus, that was a conference that my organization put on in collaboration with an international housing rights group, CORE, Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, and a Los Angeles partner group, Beyond Shelter, and other local partners. And we spent a day focusing on the human right to housing. What are the internationally recognized principles? What does the human right to housing mean? Specifically, what are its elements? And what obligations does it impose on a state or a country? And then after we spent the morning looking at that, we spent the afternoon looking at what does this mean here at home in the United States and specifically in Los Angeles, because this was a conference focused specifically on homelessness in LA, which is a big problem, as it is in many cities throughout the country.
So this was an attempt to sort of take the context of the internationally agreed standards and to see how they should be applied here at home. Is that in a sense?
Exactly.
Is that what it was
Exactly.
doing? When we think of those internationally applied standards, Maria, and the fact that this is, as you've so well pointed out, a worldwide topic, a topic of absolute worldwide importance, I think the question in anyone's mind at this point might be, what do we know comparatively? For example, I don't know if you can say this country is really terrific or this one is the champion, but are there things that we have noticed in the performance of other countries that would be useful for us here?
Yes. For one thing, we know that other countries have ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the United States has not. We know that other countries have ratified the Covenant on the Rights of Children. In fact, the entire world has, except for the United States and Somalia. And ratification of these documents is important. It does not immediately result in concrete change necessarily, but it's an important statement that that we take these issues and these rights seriously.
Is it also a statement, Maria, I think you're helping me understand something I hadn't even thought of before, that when other countries ratified the rights that you've just spoken of, and we may yet, and I think it's, as you said, pending in this country, but to the extent that is done, is that a kind of a recognition of the comprehensiveness of the problem of homelessness, that it's not just being without a home, that there are other ramifications of it?
Right. I think one important aspect of the human rights approach is that it looks at rights. All rights are interdependent. So it's not just a question of housing, it's also a question of income, jobs at a living wage, health care, and also civil and political rights, being able to vote, being able to participate in community, not being punished for status, all of which are issues for homeless and poor people here in the United States. So all of these go together, as well as responsibilities. It's not just about rights, it's also about responsibilities.
Now that's an important part. Do you mean people who might be beneficiary of actions taken to correct these things have themselves responsibilities?
Yeah, exactly. We all do.
For example, give us examples of how that would be.
Well, I guess one example is that what it means to have a right to housing or a right to a decent job at a decent wage. It means having a right to those things, but it also means being responsible then, so that, for example, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights recognizes that people who are unable to work due to disability or they've lost their job are entitled to some help and they're entitled to some support. But this is not an open-ended, this is a right that also implies a responsibility, responsibility to contribute to society. So I think that's a good way of maybe getting past some of the very punitive public dialogue we've had in the past decade or so in this country, where people who are poor, people who are beneficiaries of public aid programs are viewed as somehow not worthy.
Right.
And I think we need to, the human rights framework is very important because it's universal, and it treats everybody equally. All human beings have rights, all have responsibilities. It doesn't single out one set of people, and it's not punitive.
I think this is a very important point, Maria, because I think, as you said in the context of that answer, people who perhaps think only casually about this issue, or who think critically about it, very often don't mention the fact that when what is proposed and what is enacted elsewhere, there is this idea of balance, that both parties have responsibilities, that it's not just, and I guess the pejorative word would be a handout given to people, but that there, on both sides of the equation, there are responsibilities.
Right, and I guess I'd like to also mention in that regard, when we talk about a right to housing, what it means and what it doesn't mean. What it means is that a society, it means very specific things, like that everyone should have adequate housing, decent housing, housing that's habitable, housing that's affordable, housing that is connected to services like jobs, daycare, transportation. These are elements of what the right to housing means, but the obligation on the country that accepts this right and recognizes it are to implement it progressively and to the extent that it has resources. So it's, in a sense, it's a relative right.
Yeah, but, you know, but this brings us right to a very good point in our conversation, because a country, this country in particular, that's our particular subject here, has this right, has in fact recognized this right since 1949, but as we both know, our performance has not been adequate. I don't think anyone would say it is.
This is true.
Therefore, the question, Maria, and this may be impossible, but it's obviously germane, is, you know, why have we fallen so far short of provision of, and I guess you can think of housing also in two other categories, that is to say transitional housing for people in immediate emergency need, and permanent housing.
Right.
But in both areas, we're not performing well.
We're falling way, way short.
So
in
why?
fact, right now, only about 25% of people who are actually eligible, because they're poor enough to receive federal federal housing assistance, either through public housing or through subsidies, receive it. So that's a huge set of people who who are eligible and don't get housing assistance. Now, the 1949 Act did recognize this as a goal, did recognize housing for all Americans as a goal, but it did not actually enshrine it into a legally enforceable right.
Sort of advisory?
It's a goal. It's a goal, but there's no obligation that has any teeth to actually meet that goal, and I think that matters. I don't think that alone would make the difference, but in fact, funding for the housing programs that are created by the Act has fallen way short, and it has been cut really drastically since the beginning of the 1980s.
And this brings us to another crux of the question, Maria. Big funding falling short obviously reflects, to one degree or another, probably a very large degree, political decisions being made about where money goes. And I, in thinking about this, formed a little phrase in my mind that I hope is not too clever or trite, and that is that the homeless suffer from a kind of a paradoxical problem. That is to say, they are, on the one hand, too visible when they're viewed as a blight or a nuisance or a scourge, and then completely invisible in the sense of not being a defined political constituency.
Right.
Is that really something of the dilemma that they face?
Yes, in a word, I think that's a very good point, very insightful. I think the lack of political visibility is really key, because this is a group that is extremely marginalized. I think poor people in general are, homeless people even more so, because the lack of an address sometimes by law disenfranchises people. We have noticed that voting is extremely difficult for people without an address, and we've noticed an increase in this kind of disenfranchisement since September 11th, the events of September 11th, which resulted in heightened security concerns. You need an ID to get into a government office. You need an ID to do virtually anything, and often without an address, you have no ID.
You're no one, literally.
You're no one. And so homeless people are very much disenfranchised. Homeless people are visible, but visible in a strange way. I think there's a lot of stereotyping that happens, and people who are identified as homeless are the people who fit the stereotype, and so that stereotype gets reinforced. Many homeless people don't fit the stereotype. 44%
Right, are
of homeless
employed.
people are employed nationally, and those are people that you and I may walk by on the street and not think of as homeless.
I think everyone watching would probably say, yeah, someone who's employed I would not think of as a candidate
Exactly.
for being homeless, and yet 44% of the homeless are employed.
Right.
Which suggests to me, Maria, and this is another question, that what does that say about our wage standards? I mean, there must be a linkage, a connection somehow to the minimum wage.
Of course, there is. Our wage standards are way, way low. Minimum wage is not sufficient to allow someone, a worker, being paid minimum wage to afford housing. Anywhere, and there's a study that came out a few months ago, there's no place in the country where a minimum wage worker earns enough to pay for housing according to the federal government's own guidelines.
No.
There's no
place at
jurisdiction in the country. So, you know, I mean, housing prices have gone up enormously in the past years. So public support for housing for poor people has been cut, and wages have not kept up. So the combination of these forces means that people at the very bottom end of the income stream are really priced out, and the poorest are literally homeless.
The poorest are literally homeless, Maria, to emphasize your point. And I would think also that there's another adjacent group, so to speak, and that would be the at-risk.
Exactly.
I mean, those who are just about to go on the street, so to speak.
Right. There are many people who are at risk, and you know, there's controversy over how we define homelessness, but included in some definitions are people who are doubled up because, not by choice, but by economic necessity.
Right.
They've lost their housing, they move in with friends or relatives. And then beyond that, there are people who are perhaps a paycheck away or a health crisis away, people who have absolutely no room, you know, are living paycheck to paycheck, and they're really at risk.
They're really at risk, Maria, and now to think specifically of who we're talking about, a lot of them are the most vulnerable of our society, are they not? I mean, I'm thinking of children.
Right.
That this, well, what is, if you had to sort of give us a sense of who is homeless, in terms of magnitude of the issue, how many people, and what's the, you know, what are they made up of? What would that be?
Well, on a given night, and there are different ways to measure this, but on a given night, the one statistic is there are about 800,000 people who are literally without a place to go, who are either on the street or in a shelter or in a transitional housing facility. I'm not talking about people who are doubled or tripled out, just people with literally nowhere. And then over a period of a year, the number goes up to 2.5 to 3.5 million because people go in and out of homelessness. So if you look at it over time, look at this number over time, it's larger.
Do we have a percentage of our population that might...
that has experienced homelessness? We do.
5% perhaps, or 6%?
There was a 5-year study done in the 80s. It was 7 million over 5 years, but there was also a lifetime prevalence of about 12.5%, I believe.
Oh, I see. That's
it was a much larger number, yes.
12.5% over a lifetime.
Yeah, it was a large number.
And you mentioned this earlier also in terms of the size of this population and the derivative problems they have. Thinking of the vast numbers of children who are affected in this way, I don't know if a statistic is that important on this particular question, Maria, but I have a sense, or at least an intuition, that things like as ugly, as awful as child mortality must be particularly high among the affected population here.
Right. There are a lot of statistics on this, that children who are homeless suffer from developmental delays, from academic problems, from depression, anxiety, are less likely to be able to get a good job when they grow up, are much more at risk of becoming homeless when they grow up. Mortality rates are higher for homeless people in general. The latest statistic I have is that average life expectancy for homeless person is 51.
51.
People die much earlier.
That's almost breathtaking.
Yeah.
That is the life expectancy of a homeless person.
Average, yeah.
You know, if we turned, as I think we would want to at this point, to what proposed solutions or at least improvements there can be in this, I know that one category of them you are very much opposed to and critical of, Maria, and I would love to have you speak to this, and that's the criminalization, viewing this as a punitive issue.
Right.
And you've taken some very strong stands on this.
Yes, this is an issue we've monitored through almost since our inception. Criminalization of homelessness, what we mean by that is when cities respond to the presence of people on their streets, people living on city sidewalks, in parks, in public places, by passing laws that make it a crime to sleep in public, for example, to beg in a public place. Conduct associated with living in public. Some cities even criminally prohibit sitting on a public sidewalk.
And sometimes they demarcate specific areas of the city where you can't do these things.
Exactly, exactly. And we really feel strongly that this is the wrong approach. It's true that cities have a legitimate concern about people living in their public spaces. We agree, we share that concern. We don't think the solution is to pursue the criminal justice approach. We think the solution is to ensure that there are indoor places for people, ideally homes. So, no one likes stepping over people on the sidewalk or seeing this horrible poverty right in front of their eyes. But the solution is not to punish people. That just makes everything much worse, and it's really a poor use of public resources. It's inhumane to the people involved. If they acquire a criminal record, it makes their getting a job or a home that much harder or impossible. And it's the city spending resources that really are not designed to solve a problem.
What you're saying is those resources should go in providing the housing stock. That's the ultimate answer.
Exactly.
How do you respond to, I guess, two issues that people might raise on that, Maria? One would be, and we haven't addressed this earlier, but another stereotype people have of the homeless population is that a lot of them are mentally ill. Is that, in fact, the issue?
Well, a significant number is mentally ill. Statistics vary, but about 25 to 30% suffer from mental illness. A significant number also suffer from substance abuse addiction. Sometimes those two overlap.
Right.
But again, the solution is not to throw these people into jail. The solution is to provide mental health services or addiction services, and those are often woefully, woefully lacking.
Again and again in your responses, Maria, I'm getting the sense of we simply are not providing adequate resources.
Exactly.
I mean, if there was, I don't want to sound simplistic, but if there's a theme to things, I think that is it.
Well, that's the bottom line. That's where it comes down to. All of these problems are solvable. They're really not mysterious. They're solvable, but we have to put the resources into solving them. And for that, we also need political will.
And if we took it one step further, Maria, would we also need, and I think this is something you devoted a great deal of attention to, new sort of administrative approaches to it? I'm thinking, and I don't want to sound like someone who has a bureaucratic idea for every problem, but that perhaps there should be an agency that's devoted to this, or something definitive other than what we currently have?
Well, actually there is an agency. There is the Interagency, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. This was created in 1987 as part of the first and still only federal legislative response to homelessness, something I was very much involved in pushing for. And this legislative response was just it was intended as a first step, and unfortunately has remained as a first step. But there is an agency, but this is not an agency that has funding to give out.
I didn't even know it existed.
Well, you're probably, I'm sure, not alone. And what this agency has done is it has devoted much of its effort to getting cities and states to develop plans to end homelessness, which is a good thing, but it's not enough. And having plans is a step, but plans without resources will not result in any change. So there is an agency in place, but again, I guess you'll point out, we're coming back to the theme of resources. These agencies and any planning they do has to be backed up with resources. There's an agency, but the funding for housing especially has been cut dramatically.
If this agency, it's an interagency, is that?
Yes.
In other words, it would coordinate the activities of many, if it had what it needed itself. But it's, and as you point out, and as I've learned here today, most people don't even know it exists. political will to make it or to help it do what it needs to do seems to me to be paramount. So as we conclude our conversation, Maria, I'm wondering what you would say to the rest of us, all of us, to private citizens, about how the society may begin to enact the political will necessary to make the resources come about.
Well, I think it's important for each of us to be aware that homelessness is a problem with a solution. It can be solved. To become aware, to educate ourselves, first of all, about who homeless people are and what some of the solutions are. Housing, jobs that pay a living wage, services, including health, mental health care. Those are the solutions, and to really demand that our political representatives, either at the local, the state, or the federal level, or all three, take actions that are constructive, not punitive, but constructive and reasonable, rational actions that can actually solve this problem. We have information on our website, which is www.nlchp.org. If you'll allow me that.
I definitely will. You can repeat that. I think it's that important.
Okay, it's nlchp.org, and we have information on the issue, on the problem, and solutions. And we'd be glad to hear from listeners and viewers.
I certainly hope people do consult that website. I know I will, because given the nature of our entire conversation, Maria, it does seem to me that this is something we can do. We have the resources here. It's just a problem of putting them in the right place.
Exactly. Exactly.
Maria Foscarinis, thank you so much for coming and having this conversation with me. I've certainly learned a lot from it.
Well, thank you, George.
You're very welcome.
It's been a pleasure to be here with you.
All of mine. I want to get you back here.
Okay.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. Thank you, Maria.